Welcome to Sophia&Co. I'm Sophie Shepard-Natze. Diagnosed with autism as a baby, doctors said he'd never live a life outside a special institution, but he proved them wrong. Now he's a professor teaching others about the need of people with autism. Dr. Stephen Shore is my guest today.
The number of children affected by autism is on the rise, but the condition remains hard to define. While many think it's an illness, the people who have autism don't consider themselves sick. What does it mean to be so different? Are autistic people really disadvantaged? Can they be integrated into society? And can society benefit from their innate talent?
Dr. Stephen Shore, professor at Adelphi University, autism researcher, lecturer, diagnosed with ASD himself. Welcome. It's really great to have you on our show today. So let's start from the big thing, autism. What is it? Is it a neurological disorder or is it a psychological thing?
Well, autism is a neurological difference. I look at autism as a non-standard way of perceiving and processing the environment. And in doing so, it causes differences in communication, social interaction, sensory issues, and it also results in us having a widely varying skill set, which means the things that we're good at, we can be extremely good at, and the things that challenge us can be extremely challenging.
I just want to go to the origins of where it comes from. Autism is the second most prevalent neurodevelopmental disorder among children today. About 1 in 68 children has been identified with ASD in the United States. Why is it growing so fast? Has it always been there, but we just didn't know about it before?
Even just a generation ago, we see a sharp increase in the prevalence of autism from 1 in 10,000 to now 1 in 68 in the United States. And I believe it's a combination of greater awareness, an expansion of the definition of autism, and also I think we may be doing something to the environment which may be causing an increase.
Well, talking about the environment, there's a new study found that says that exposure to several common agricultural pesticides during pregnancy increases the risk of autism for children. Is that something you would agree with?
I would say that at least it's something that's worth looking at and validating this study. We know that pesticides have been causing other health problems, so it's possible that that's also causing or contributing to an increase in autism. I do know that the environment is dirtier than it used to be, and that's causing an increase in all kinds of disorders.
But I mean, you researched autism. Do you have one core reason that causes autism, that causes this disorder, or there is no such thing, or we still don't know where it comes from?
Well, at this point, the best minds in research believe autism starts with a genetic predisposition. And that can be seen as autistic characteristics tend to run in families. When I meet children on the autism spectrum, I often see those characteristics in their parents or other siblings, so that speaks to genetics. If we get deep into the science of genetics, the best that they've come to this point is that the characteristics of autism are spread over more than 100 genes. And then this genetic predisposition interacts with something in the environment. And we have a lot of clues as to what that is. It might be, as you just mentioned, possibly pesticides, possibly other things. The problem is that we don't have a firm grasp on exactly what those triggers are.
Mm-hmm. Now, talking about real life, what is it like to be an autistic individual and at the same time live a highly functioning social life? Does it stress you out? Is it stressing?
Well, it can be. For those of us on the spectrum who are socializing, who are out in the community, it requires a lot of thought, keeping track of the rules of social interaction. It almost seems like that most people have these rules built into their brains. It's almost as if the program is hardwired. But for those of us on the autism spectrum, even though it may not be hardwired, the good news is that we can learn these rules of social interaction. The challenge can be that, number one, we have to be taught, and then two, we have to keep these rules in our minds as we socially interact. So, for example, sometimes I have to even remind myself to make sure I give proper eye contact, that I'm properly interpreting nonverbal communication, and I believe that most people who are not on the autism spectrum don't think about these things.
So you're saying the double meanings are really hard to grasp for autistic people. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. Double meanings, idioms, mixed emotions, office politics, these can all be very challenging for those of us with autism. And it just so happens to be that because this is a challenge for me, it's actually become an area of special interest, something that I enjoy studying and thinking about and learning about. However, practicing it in real time can be a challenge.
Now, we all know that school is a cruel environment. Children aren't that tolerant to someone being different. Children are actually pretty mean. How did you deal with it? I mean, you being very different from others in high school.
Well, I found public school, a grade school for me, was very difficult because, as you said, I was different, very different from my classmates. So that meant there was a lot of bullying and teasing. And even to today, we find that more people than not on the autism spectrum are bullied in school. And I believe the resolution to this problem is education. Education and developing awareness in students at the grade school level of people who have differences. Because with greater awareness, with explanations as to why their classmate might be behaving in a certain way or doing a certain thing, comes the power to be of help. And I've seen situations where a child whose diagnosis of autism was explained to a classroom, where work has been done in appreciating and understanding differences, the classmates become helpful to that student and bullying decreases sharply.
Now, tell me something. How come some people with autism are able to find personal fulfillment in life, like yourself, and then others are stuck at a certain point in development and can never integrate into society? What does that depend on?
Well, autism is an extremely widely varying condition, and I believe some of the preconditions for promoting success and fulfillment in people with autism has to do with recognizing the strengths and accepting people for autism as who they are, but at the same time realizing that there may be significant challenges that need to be overcome. So when I was diagnosed with autism, I was pretty significantly affected. I was nonverbal, I had meltdowns, and nobody knew what to do in those days. When I finally did get a diagnosis, my parents accepted me for who I was, but at the same time recognized that there were significant challenges to be overcome if I were to lead a fulfilling and productive life.
Now, like you've said, the prognosis for your future was pretty dire. I mean, institutions, doctors said you were very ill, but you were able to overcome all of that. What was the most important thing that helped you overcome it?
The most important thing was that my parents believed that I was an intelligent person, and they responded to my interests. They promoted my interests. So, for example, at age 4, I was found in the kitchen taking apart watches with a sharp kitchen knife, taking out the motor, the gears, the hands, everything, and putting it all back together again, and the watch still worked. So instead of looking at that as perhaps some sort of strange behavior, and maybe I should be focusing more on social interaction or communication, soon my parents provided all kinds of other things to take apart. So I think promoting those interests in people with autism is an important road, an important key to success. And I find that those on the autism spectrum who are successful have found a way in which to follow their interests.
Now, tell me something. If an autistic person has someone who gives him extra time, extra care, and has an understanding and acceptance of who or she is. Does that mean that that person can certainly overcome autism?
I think it increases the probability that they can learn better how to work with their autistic characteristics. So when we talk about overcoming autism, I wonder if a better word is learning how to work with the characteristics of autism. So I still have autism, I still have challenges. I've learned how to work around these challenges and even to avoid some of those challenges that are particularly difficult, but still I'm able to lead a fulfilling and productive life.
Dr. Shore, we're going to take a short break right now, and when we come back, we're going to continue to talk to Dr. Stephen Shore, autism expert, and we'll talk about problems of integration for autistic individuals and the nuances of their vision of the world. Stay tuned.
Reversals of fortune and stalemate. The harder the Western-backed regime in Kiev assaults the resistance in the east, the more the resistance is able to push back. Washington's support of a military solution is flagging, as well as Poroshenko's popularity.
This is about making the business survive.
Corporations don't love. Corporations don't hate. Corporations have no feelings. Corporations don't care about you or me. Corporations only care about profit.
People come to untouched forests and leave massive glades for the sake of art.
We're not going to quit. We will not stop until it is done.
What is more precious, music or wood?
Dramas that can't be ignored. Stories others refuse to notice. Faces changing the world right now. A full picture of today's news. Live, on demand, from around the globe. Rockley.tv.
We're back with Dr. Stephen Shore, professor at Adelphi University, autism researcher diagnosed with ASD himself. Welcome back to the show. Now, let me ask you, is it important for people with autism to be integrated into the society, or it just feels more comfortable to be in your own world?
Well, I think it's important for those of us with autism to be integrated into society. Society is pretty much integrated with, we're all integrated with ourselves, with each other, I should say. And as for being in our own world, the way I look at it is that people with autism are in the world, and in some cases are in the world too much. And what I mean by that is that due to sensory sensitivities, we may perceive light, vision, sound, touch, and other things more strongly than other people. And if these sensations are too strong, they can cause the person with autism to be overwhelmed and then appear to withdraw.
So sensory sensitivity that you mentioned, is that a common thing for all who have autism? What forms does it take?
Well, at this point, everybody who I've met on the autism spectrum has sensory issues. I do have a friend on the spectrum who says he doesn't have any sensory issues at all, but I also wonder why the shades are down in his house and the lights are off. And the way these sensory issues can take place, for example, many people with autism perceive fluorescent lights like most people perceive a strobe light. So imagine having to go through work all day or go through school the entire day in a room that's lit with a strobe light. It's certainly going to have an effect on your productivity.
Professor, what do you see and understand that other people don't?
That's a good question, because so often the focus is on what people with autism don't perceive that most people do, but we can also flip that on its head and recognize that there may be things that people with autism recognize and see and perceive that other people or most other people don't. And things that I often perceive that other people don't include patterns, disruption in those patterns. For example, that makes me a very good proofreader, or I can even see in a document if a picture is even 1 pixel to one side or another too far. Autism also helps me be a good musician and also understanding mechanical devices. So these are some of the strengths that autism brings to me that tend to be beyond the typical population.
And what is the hardest thing for you to handle while interacting with others?
The hardest thing for me to handle is when there's mixed messages or mixed emotions. So that is, for example, when a person is saying one thing, but they're actually feeling something else.
You said you're studying that phenomenon. Why is it so difficult for an autistic person to understand what the other person is feeling? Did you come up with an answer?
I believe that the difficulty stems from a difficulty or a challenge in reading nonverbal communication. Research suggests that nonverbal communication makes up to 80%, and some researchers believe even up to 93% of total interaction. So that means those of us on the spectrum are only getting maybe 7% or 20% of the total interaction package. And that 7 or 20% is just words. So we're highly dependent or over-dependent on the written or spoken word when we have difficulty perceiving what is known as pragmatics, or what is happening between the lines or behind those words. And that is why, we tend to be very literal in our interpretation of language, because that's all we have, without the backdrop of the nonverbals.
Now, you also said that music is better understood by people with autism than words. Do we know why?
I believe that whatever scrambles the speech centers of the brain leave the musical ones intact. One of my activities includes giving music lessons to children on the autism spectrum. And I find that those individuals I work with, they're all over the spectrum. Some are verbal, some are hyperverbal, some are nonverbal. And their skill set also ranges over the entire spectrum, where some of them could be professional musicians if they so choose, and others work harder at it, but they still enjoy it. And I believe whatever the neurological reason is that allows people who stutter to not stutter when they sing is likely the same reason that music can speak to many people with autism, whereas verbal interaction may not, or it may be difficult.
Now, since you're saying that it's really hard for you to read between the lines, how did you figure out what to do in your personal life? Because you went to school, you went to college. I mean, you've had several dating experiences before you got married. So how did that happen for you? Did you make friends right away? And how were you dating women if it was so hard for you to understand the unspoken, the unsaid?
Well, part of it is studying nonverbal communication and what it is. Well, once I realized that nonverbal communication was you might say, a channel of interaction, that caused me to become extremely interested in it. And I would spend hours reading books on body language, social interaction, dating, relationships, and so on. So I did my own intensive study on it. Another thing that helps me is just being very vocal about things I don't understand. So, for example, perhaps with my wife, it means that we have to talk about things more than perhaps the average couple, and there isn't that, you might say, magical mind reading that couples are supposed to have. We just realize that it's either not there or it's going to be less than an atypical couple. So we talk about things perhaps more than others, and in that way, perhaps having autism even helps the relationship because we have to talk about issues in order to understand them.
Tell me something, is there such thing as intuition for autists? Do you have it?
Yes, I do. People with autism do have intuition. I know many people with autism who are in some ways very good at reading certain aspects of people. I believe I'm pretty good at catching certain things about people when I interact with them. And it may be that we look at things differently than the typical population. So in that way, it can be helpful.
So you said you studied body language like people study math or physics. You've been married for 20 years now. What about your wife? Was she familiar with your condition? How did she approach the whole thing when you guys started dating and living together?
Well, that's a very interesting question. When we started dating, and my wife, like the other women I've dated, I never was able to perceive the nonverbal cues that indicated that the woman was interested in me. So they would have to basically just tell me. And the same thing with my wife. We had met as music students, and we started by reviewing each other's homework, which then morphed towards doing things socially. And then one day at a beach, she suddenly gave me a hug and a kiss and held my hand. And at that point, I had a bit of a social story down, having been through some experiences of just not getting it. And at that point, I created a bit of a social story, which went something like this. If a woman hugs you, kisses you, and holds your hand all at about the same time, it probably means they want to be your girlfriend, and if that's the case, you better have an answer right away. It could be yes, no, or further investigation and analysis is indicated. And it seemed to be a good thing to do, and as a result, we've now been married for a little over 24 years.
Now, you were hired as a professor because of your autistic abilities, not in spite of your autistic limitations. So autism can turn from an inhibition, as it is commonly perceived, to an advantage, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I believe that we're reaching a cusp or a realization as a society that people with autism potentially have great contributions to make to society. And we're beginning to see organizations, schools, and businesses and otherwise seeking out and hiring people with autism for those characteristics. So when I interviewed for my job at Adelphi University, they had done their research, and it was a very good and refreshing interview, because instead of my disclosing that I have autism and trying to convince them this is why you might want to hire a person with autism than someone who doesn't have autism, it was more about, we could just focus on the aspects of the job and whether I was suitable for the position. We see other organizations such as SAP, which is a big software company that is now collaborating with Specialist Stern, which translates to the specialists in Danish. And together they're hiring people with autism, they're seeking people with autism because of the skills they have in information technology. And I believe we're just getting to a point now where society is beginning to realize that there are some strengths that people with autism have that can be very useful in an employment situation.
Professor, just really quickly, what is the most common, the biggest misconception about autism? Just in a nutshell.
I believe the most common misconception about autism is that people with autism do not want to interact with others and do not have emotions. And in my in my communicating with my colleagues on the autism spectrum and meeting hundreds of people on the autism spectrum, Number one, I find that we have emotions just like everybody else, and that we do desire to interact with others. I believe that myth may stem from that those of us with autism, because we interact differently and communicate differently, many of our social interactions end up in a failure, sometimes catastrophic failure. And if anybody had the same amount of failure in attempting to successfully socially interact, then maybe they too would give up on interacting with others.
Professor, thank you so much for this amazing insight into the world of autism. We thank you for the interview. We wish you all the best with your research. We're talking to Dr. Stephen Shore, autism researcher, lecturer, author, diagnosed with ASD himself, talking about where autism comes from, where it stands right now in the world, and how autistic people should be integrated into society. That's it for this edition of Sophia&Co. I will see you next time.